Now that all of our pieces are cut out, machined, and sanded up to 220 grit, we're now gonna break out the plywood stock that's gonna serve as the tray in our serving tray. So this is 1/8 inch plywood. I have oversized cut a bunch and they're in the cupboard at the John Oliver shop. So that way you don't have to worry about dealing with a big 4x8 sheet. So I have cut these so that you will have to rip the length, or rip them to width, as well as cross cut them to their finished length. So we need 2 measurements before we start cutting. The first is going to be our width, our finished width, and then the second is going to be our finished length. So to figure out the finished width, it is very simple. It's going to be the same size as our end piece or our handle. So with a tape measure, you can measure it. It should be around 334 millimeters. And mine is sitting at about 333, so that's why it's good to measure. Everyone's will be a little bit different. So just have a pencil and paper with you. So that you can record your measurement. I'll also show you a trick for measuring this when we get over to the table saw. So that's gonna be our finished width of our plywood. And now for the finished length, there's a quick math calculation that we need. It's very simple. You are going to measure from the inside of each rabbet on your side piece. So at the shoulder of each rabbet. So for mine, it is 466 millimeters. So 466. And then you need to add the amount of the groove on either side, because you're gonna have the plywood is gonna slide in here on both ends. So you need to add the amount of the groove. And for us, we used an imperial measurement, which is 3/8 of an inch. And that in metric is going to be, converts to 9.5 millimeters. So you're gonna add that to both sides of your tray. So that ends up being 19 millimeters. So I have 466 millimeters plus 19 for the groove on either side. So that gets me a length of 485 millimeters. So now again, just to summarize, I have my finished width, which is going to be the same size as my end piece, and the finished length, which is going to be from this shoulder to this shoulder of the side piece, plus 19 millimeters to account for the groove. So to start off, I'm going to go to the ripping table saw and rip this to a finished width. And I'll show you a quick tip for setup when we get over there. Here we are at the table saw that we use for rip cutting. And there are a few tips for ripping plywood compared to our other stock that we've been ripping previously. The first thing is to give us the best cut possible and reduce any tear out. We're actually going to raise the blade height higher than we normally would. So normally we have it to the bottom of the gullet, which is about a 1/2 inch. We're gonna actually raise that a bit more, about 1 inch to 1.5 inches above our workpiece. So again, just in the front of the saw, raise that up. There we go, that should be good. And the reason that we do this is because of grain tear out. Tear out occurs when the back of the wood is unsupported and the grain is unsupported. So this is going to limit the chance of that happening as the blade comes through our piece, because it'll be coming downwards rather than across our piece more if the blade is higher. And the second thing that we're gonna do at the table saw when we're ripping plywood is, on ours we have a nice veneer on one side and not as nice of a side on the other. We're gonna make sure that we put our nice side facing up, and again, that's going to prevent tear out as much as possible. And like I said earlier, I was going to give you a tip for setup for ripping to the final width. And that is, instead of using the measuring tape to go to 333 millimeters or 334 millimeters, we're actually just going to use our end piece and use that to set our fence distance. So I'm just going to put it between the blade and the fence, and I'm going to bring the fence in until it just touches the table saw blade. Then I'm going to lock that in. And it's actually preferable that our fence is ever so slightly closer towards the blade so that our tray is going to be a tiny bit smaller than the interior of the grooves. This is going to give it a bit of a floating effect, and the reason for that is after we glue up, in case in seasons with wood swelling bigger and smaller, that if it was touching, there's a chance that it could warp or distort our piece. So if it's about 0.5 millimeter shorter in width and length, that's actually going to be a benefit to us. So if you can set the fence by holding your end piece to the table saw blade and making sure that it is about halfway, the end of it is about halfway at the table saw blade, then that's going to be the best situation for us. I'll bring you in closer to show you what I mean. And here we are with the end piece mocked up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just make sure that it can fit between the blade and the fence. And then I'm just going to bring it in ever so slightly and lock that down. And now if you'll notice here, the end piece just comes into the blade a little bit, about like 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter. So it's about in the middle of the table saw blade. So after running the plywood through, it's going to be just a hair less than our end piece. So that's set up properly. And also you can see our table saw blade is set quite high, which is another thing we want, and that's going to give us the best cut possible. So now that our blade height is set and our fence is set up, we're about ready to cut. Obviously we're going to wear eye protection, and because this fence is so far away from the blade and there's so much room right here, we're not going to worry about using a push stick, because it's going to actually be more difficult to use a push stick rather than using your thumb, which can have a feeling on the edge to know if you have a nice positive grip or not. And cutting plywood is super similar to cutting hardwood when we've been cutting that before. All we're going to be worried about is keeping consistent pressure on this fence. So normally you might think it makes sense to stare at the table saw blade when cutting, but for this instance, all we're going to watch is where our plywood meets the fence and make sure there's as little gap there as possible. We want consistent pressure against the fence so that it stays on the fence the whole way. And we're just going to push this all the way through. And for you guys, you'll have a catcher on the other side. But once you hear it stop cutting, don't stop pushing, because just because it has stopped making noise doesn't mean the cut is over. Because now we're still in this no man's land between the fence and the table saw blade, and if anything was to happen and it could move sideways, that would end up resulting in kickback, which we really want to avoid. So you want to really make sure you push all the way through and the catcher can catch on the other side. And again, consistent pressure on the fence. Also, these boards that I've cut are quite oversized, so if you want a bit of practice, do this in a couple of cuts and sneak down to that final width just to get more and more practice ripping plywood on the table saw. Now that everything's set up, we're ready to cut. Again, just staring at this fence, making sure we keep consistent pressure there. My left hand is going to stay on the table planted, and my right hand is going to do all the pushing. So my left hand can support the edge of the wood but not come too close to the blade. Right hand is going to push all the way through. This is a cut you probably could even do one-handed if you wanted. The left hand really isn't doing much. Just make sure it does not travel with the wood, as I've seen a lot of people have a tendency to do. So it's going to stay planted, and then I'm going to run the piece all the way through. Now that our board is cut to its finished width, we're going to move on to the crosscut sled and cut it to its finished length. And here we are at the crosscut sled, ready to cut our plywood to finished length. And the same tips go as they did before with cutting plywood, is we want to raise the blade height and make sure we put the good side facing up. So I'm going to do that right away. There we are. My blade is higher than it would normally be, so that the motion is traveling downwards through the cut. And a couple more tips. One, I'm going to try to use the same tape measure that I used to do the measurements off of my side piece originally, just in case there is a bit of a difference in the end. Sometimes there's a bit more play with the tab at the end. So it's just good habit and good practice to get used to using the same tape measure. And again, just like I said before, my measurement for this is from the inside of the shoulder of each rabbet plus 19 millimeters, which is going to account for the groove on either side. So usually when we're here at the crosscut sled and we set up a stop block, we use the side with the notch away. We use the side that the notch has been taken away. For this time, because our plywood is so thin, that would actually go under that notch. I'm going to flip this around and use the flat side. Since we're only doing one cut here, we don't really have to worry about dust buildup here. If we were doing a bunch of repetitive cuts, that is the point of the notch. So that's something that I'm going to use. I've got my clamp. I'm going to measure to 485 millimeters, which was my measurement plus 19. And again, just like before when we cut it to width, I'm going to go a hair less than that. So I'll probably go, rather than 485, I might go 484 or 484 and a half, something along those lines. So I'd like to use a stop block just to make sure that I don't overcut and have too small of a tray at the end. So the stop block just allows me to make sure the setup is correct and I can double check my measurements. And for you guys, it's much easier to set up the stop block from the front side of the crosscut sled. You're gonna just have an easier time seeing the measurements. For myself, I'm quite tall, so I can kind of reach over and see. But I think from this front side of the crosscut sled is much easier. So I'm looking for 485 millimeters. .485 minus a little bit. And I'll apply my clamp. And I'll double check my measurement. Perfect, still 485 minus a little bit. And cutting plywood here is very similar to our process before. We are going to cut a little bit off the front side, and then we're going to slide it all the way till it butts up against the stop block, and then I'm going to cut out the remainder on the back side. So it's just the same as before, a few other times we've used this. When we're holding the plywood down, rather than just putting our fingers down here, it's actually going to be useful for us to hold the front lip of the plywood with our hand, and then our other hand is going to push the sled. So this hand is kind of pushing the stock down and back so that it's snug against the rail. We're going to go all the way forward, all the way back, slide it across, and do the same thing over here. All the way forward, all the way back. And I'll show you how that looks. Here we are, I have my plywood cut. Now, one more thing I'm gonna do before I'm done is I'm just gonna go and get a few clamps and do a dry fit to make sure that everything fits properly. So I'll go get my pieces and I'll do a dry fit and I'll show you what that looks like.